This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, it's so good to have you back on the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and we are all about taking your leadership to the next level. And to help us do that, we have Richard Blackaby.
Good to be with you, Sam.
Always a pleasure.
Certainly, with all the craziness over the last month or so, it's a time certainly that we need our leadership to go to another level.
Absolutely. I mean, unless you've been living under a rock for the past few weeks and months, now more than ever, we need leaders to lead. And to help us do that, we're going to look in the past.
Yeah.
And as we so often do on this podcast, we do what we call a leader profile. And today we're looking at the life and leadership of Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah.
Which I believe is the guy that Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote a box office hit with in a Broadway play based on. Is that the same?
It is.
It's the same guy, right?
And
So he did something in history, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Well, and I'd like to see that play. I know you and Carrie had tickets to it.
We were going to go see it, and as with many other things, it got rescheduled. So hopefully still in the future.
Which is, it was fascinating to me because I've not seen the Broadway play yet myself, but I've read the biography that it was based on by Ron Chernow. And of course, Chernow has written several biographies that I've really enjoyed. He's just, he's the kind of guy that when he writes a biography, you just buy it, you read it. And so he did one on Rockefeller and has done just a couple of just classic, I think J.P. Morgan, and because
we've used him. That's the one that we based the Rockefeller profile, I think, was Chernow, wasn't it?
Yeah. And so he's just done some great biographies. He's thorough. He's I think a good historian, and so I like what he does. And so they actually took his biography and that's the one they based the Broadway play on. So, right. But Hamilton's just one of those fascinating people that just and he's one of those controversial people. In fact, as I'm reading it, oftentimes I can't help but think about current times. Politics of today, and sometimes you think, boy, things have never been uglier, and why are people being so personal attacks and so on? And then you read back a couple hundred years and realize, well, they were doing that right almost from the very beginning.
Yeah, it was pretty nasty, even basically from the founding onwards. It is a pretty hardcore politics. So the obvious question would be, what about Alexander Hamilton merits a podcast? And obviously, there have been many books written about him, and he's a large figure in American history. But why have you chosen him today?
It's interesting. I've got, of course, I try to read a biography on every American president, and so I've had this biography for a little while, but I was feeling like I need to read. Make sure I covered all the presidents first. And he obviously was never elected president, so he was always kind of on a back burner. Yeah. And at a certain point, though, his name kept coming up, especially when you read biographies on Washington and Madison, Jefferson, and so on, Monroe. And so I just got to the point of realizing this guy he just looms there. I need to go ahead and read his biography. And once I did, I just saw so many really helpful insights to his life and to this biography. Partly, it gives you a really good glimpse at today and how things seem similar. Yeah. But also, there's so much debate these days about what did the founding fathers intend, and what's the Constitution trying to do and protect. Why are we a republic and not just a straight democracy? And now a bunch of people want to change some of those things. Yeah. And I just thought it would be really helpful to go back to the beginning, the people who put it together, and read why did they do that. And so
I feel like I've been hearing a lot even lately about pure democracy versus a republic. Yeah. It's kind of cropped up in popular debate. So maybe let's begin with what were some of the things that Hamilton had to overcome before he became the Alexander Hamilton.
Well, I'll tell you, and there's some things about him, and I don't know why when they put the Broadway play together that they chose him over other people. But if you read his story, it is in so many ways the American dream. But of course, he's not even, and I don't think I knew this. He wasn't born in America. He was born in the West Indies, and in a very poor family. He was probably illegitimate child, and he was born into on an island that had a lot of slavery. And one of the things you discover about Hamilton is that of all of the founding fathers, he was certainly the most anti-slavery of them all. Of course, he never owned slaves himself, but was very much against it, and was adamant against it. Whereas many of the original presidents all owned slaves themselves. I think there were about 9 presidents who owned slaves, and Washington, I think, was the only one who actually released his slaves, and he did it when he died in his will, but some didn't even do it then. So, but he was born, and his mother, Rachel, had inherited her parents separated, and so his grandparents were, I don't know if they were officially divorced, but they were separated, and so Hamilton's mother, her father left her just a little bit of money in his will. And so when she's just a young girl, like 16 years old, she's got this small, modest inheritance. And so this man swoops in to marry her. He's 28, she's 16, and he basically just needs some money, a stake, to help him get ahead. And he marries this young girl, takes her money, spends it all, and is very abusive to her, disrespectful, maybe been unfaithful, but the marriage falls apart right away. And so they have a child together named Peter, and they very soon she abandons her husband. The tragic thing is she abandons her son as well. I guess she just felt like she had to escape, and so she just flees from this tyrannical, abusive relationship. And but her husband is, we don't know all the story, but he acts like quite a jerk to her even afterward. And that's why she left apparently in the first place. But then he accuses her of all kinds of infidelity and adultery and so on. And she may have been guilty of some of that, at least afterward. Just trying to survive, I guess, as a woman in a very tough man's world. But she actually even gets put in jail for about 7 months for being an adulteress. And then when she's supposed to go to court, she just kind of flees and doesn't really contest it, which makes her look guilty, of course. And so the courts rule that she cannot get married again. And because her husband gets to basically be the only guy in court, he gets everything his way, where he's completely innocent and he's just the victim and she's the bad person. So eventually she meets Hamilton, the father of Alexander Hamilton, James Hamilton, and Hamilton is like the 4th son of a Scottish minor lord in Scotland. He's never going to inherit the estate. He's got to go fend for himself. So he ends up in the West Indies. Seemed like a nice enough person, but no ambition. A bit of a lazy streak in him. He meets Rachel and marries her. I don't know if he ever does marry her because she can't legally be married. And so they have 2 children together, 2 sons, and the second son is Alexander. And so Alexander is born illegitimate, and then his father leaves. He abandons the family soon afterwards. So his mother is a single mom of 2 kids, and so she ends up trying to run a business and trying to just earn a living to provide for her 2 sons. And she may well have used her womanly graces to try to get some men to help her out or do things or whatever. Her ex-husband keeps on accusing her of that. Well, eventually, the mother and Alexander both get deathly ill. They're actually in the same bed together, trying to recover from their illness, and the mother dies. And so Alexander's mother dies, literally sharing the same, probably double bed with him, and she's not even hardly been like dealt with yet as a corpse, and the people are already coming to like foreclose on all of the house and the property. And her former husband has claimed all of her possessions for the son that she abandoned, and the courts find in favor of that. So Alexander and his brother have nothing. They've just lost their mother. Now they're booted out. Even their books and toys and things are all being possessed to be given to their older stepbrother or half-brother. And so eventually they're taken in by an older cousin or uncle. And it looks like, well, maybe at least they'll have someone that will care for them. And then one day that guardian is found in a bloody mess in his bed, and looks like has committed suicide. And so, I mean, when you watch that, you just, it's just unbelievable how awful Alexander Hamilton's life was. His mother is being accused of just being a tramp, and he's grown up in poverty. He's grown up around slavery, and it's all been about money and trying to just get it where you can. A father that's shiftless, and he disappears, and basically Alexander doesn't see him again either. And so you look at that and say, now how did this guy end up being basically the right hand of George Washington as they're founding the United States? And so he, there's lots of, I mean, it's a complicated, detailed story, but he goes from that. If you could imagine waking up one day and your guardian has committed suicide and you've got nowhere to go, nobody to take you in. You would think, here's a guy that will never make it into history anywhere. He'll just be one of countless millions of people that just died quietly somewhere in some out-of-the-way place that you never heard of. But that tells you something about Hamilton. Is he's got a fierce ambition to prove that he's a worthwhile human being. And he's going to spend his whole life trying to fight against the ghosts of his past. He rarely ever talked about his past, and he kind of glossed over some of it. He always was sensitive to the charges of illegitimacy and so on. And interestingly, he eventually gets taken in by a man. And what's interesting about that is that his brother doesn't get taken in, just he does to this man. And his last is Thomas Stevens. And what's interesting about that is that Thomas Stevens has a son named Edward Stevens, and everybody who met Edward, and he was about the same age as Alexander, everyone who ever met him were amazed at how close the two looked alike. They looked like brothers, and they're very, very similar looking. And so there's many, many speculations around Alexander Hamilton, but one of them is that the reason that Thomas Stevens took in Alexander, not his brother, is that he may well have been the father. He may have actually been, James Hamilton may not have really been the real father anyway, and that would explain why James Hamilton never felt any fatherly affection, connection to his son, but left him alone. And yet this man takes him in and helps him out, and his son, Edward Stevens, and Alexander will be friends for life, always close. And yet Alexander doesn't keep up with technically is only his brother.
Wow.
And so anyway, lots of scandal questions.
Well, what a beginning to a life. It's hard to imagine or even put yourself in those shoes. But we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to look at what happened after that and how someone can go from such a low station in life and, like you said, rise up to be the right hand of one of the founding fathers of the United States. Hey, it's Sam here, and I don't know about you, but life has changed significantly in the last few weeks. Not going to work like we normally do, not being able to see friends and family like we used to, and I know I'm not alone in this, and many of you have also experienced massive changes in your daily life. And because of that, here at Blackaby Ministries, we started doing a Facebook Live devotional with Richard, and we do this every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And you can ask your questions live. You can interact with our community. It's just a way to check in with everyone and hopefully be encouraged in the middle of the week. We'd love to see you there. And we're probably going to do this until life goes back to something that resembles normal. Okay, now back to the show. So, Richard, we saw how Against All Odds is sort of the backdrop, the beginnings of Alexander Hamilton's life, and most unlikely of heroes of America, if you will. And we got to the point where he's taken in by, some speculate, could be his biological father.
Yeah.
And so where does he go from there? And maybe we skip ahead a little bit and kind of look at his contributions and what made him such a great leader.
Yeah, Alexander, what he's going to discover is he's great with words. He's a good writer, he's a good speaker, and that's going to be his salvation. It's interesting, a hurricane hits that part of the world, and he writes a letter to his father telling him about it. And in those days, he still would write his father now and then, although I don't know that he ever saw him. And the minister in the island, sees this letter, and it's so eloquent, so well written, that he asked if he can submit it to a magazine. And he does, and he wins a prize. And from that prize, people decide that they're going to sponsor him and send him to America to go to school.
Wow.
And one thing you find about Alexander is that he has this knack of winning the favor of older, powerful men. George Washington will be one of those. At this point, the minister on the island shows him favor, and because of a letter written to his father that someone happens to see, someone happens to send to a magazine, and so he ends up getting sent to America, and he just always has this ambition. He's always in a hurry to try to prove himself. Some people you look at and say, how did he do so much? And you marvel at how much Hamilton accomplished.
Yeah.
But it's like he felt like he was trying to make up for lost time. And so even the first place he goes is to Princeton to look at going to school. But when he meets with the president, he says, well, but I want you to allow me to basically go through faster than normal. I want to kind of cut down the years and get through faster. And when they wouldn't let him do that, it seemed a little audacious at the time for a guy who's just been sponsored even to come to America in the first place. And now he's saying, I want to do this faster than just someone who grew up here. He ends up going to King's College, which eventually will be Columbia. And while he's there, the Revolutionary War breaks out. And one thing about Hamilton is he seemed to have a knack for always being at the right place at the right time. Mm-hmm. And most of the Revolutionary War events, he has a way of showing up. And so eventually he makes a speech defending the Boston Tea Party, and he discovers he's actually really good at giving speeches. He's good at writing. And he uses his writing and speeches for the rest of his life. That the word becomes his weapon. And eventually he's only 21 years old, and he volunteers to be a captain of the artillery. And they're kind of testing him. They said, well, you need to recruit 30 men to serve in your unit. Well, he recruits them that same day. He just very thorough, very aggressive, you give Hamilton a task and he's going to have it done and far better than you ever thought, and a record time, and eventually catches the eye of George Washington. Washington asks him to come be his aide and really becomes his right-hand man. He writes most of the orders that Washington will send to the field. Hamilton writes, and oftentimes doesn't even dictate it. He'll just say, Hamilton, tell General so-and-so to move his troops there, and Hamilton will just go and write it all out and take care of it. And so eventually when Washington is elected the first president, he's going to make Hamilton his first Treasury Secretary. And Hamilton, and so much we could talk about, but he just seems to be so future-oriented. But yet we don't realize this now, but back then, the U.S. was an agrarian society, and there were a lot of people who really feared kings, for one thing, and they feared big business and big money. They just felt like these powerful, wealthy people could dominate a country.
Yeah.
And so there was a huge division. Thomas Jefferson just wanted a bunch of farmers to just have the least amount of government possible. And Hamilton realized, well, we're going to have to promote business. There's nothing wrong with farmers, but we need to promote business and banking and financing and so on if we're ever going to become a great nation. And over again, Hamilton will push things that at the time are seen as very unpopular, but you looking back later, you realize, well, he was right.
Yeah.
And his critics were wrong. And the interesting thing, just that maybe, so many things. Now Hamilton, of course, is on the $10 bill. We don't have the time to list all the different contributions he makes to turn America into basically a capitalist society that promotes free enterprise, and banking and financing that enables that to happen. But what saved Hamilton is that he always had wealthy people, powerful men that would kind of help him. And George Washington was the most famous of all. And Washington was not as brilliant in some ways as Hamilton wasn't as eloquent, wasn't as good of a writer. He really needed Hamilton's words to help him. But what Washington was really good at was wisdom, being prudent. He never seemed to overstep. Washington had an uncanny knack for just the right amount of response and no more, and holding his tongue and just doing what needed to be done. And Hamilton, on the other hand, he needs that restraint.
Yeah.
He has a tendency to go all in and just pull out his saber and go slashing and attack his enemies. And
would you say he would jump first and figure out how to fly on the way down?
He was he would study and he would read and he would do his homework. He'd be very thorough, but he only had really one speed, and that was just all out, take no prisoners. And whereas Washington would do enough to win the battle, he would not necessarily antagonize his enemies for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And Hamilton just had a way. He had people who loved him very much and very loyal to him, but he also accumulated a long list of powerful enemies who just really hated him. And I couldn't help but think of Donald Trump as I read about Hamilton, because they just said there was just no neutral ground with him. You loved him or you hated him, and the ones who hated him were just determined to destroy him and were constantly worrying about what he was up to, and was he going to go too far, and was it going to be a power grab, and was he going to try to just make Washington the king, or was he going to try to take over with the army and become king himself? And it's really interesting to read all the fear that he created from just his enthusiasm and his almost overkill to get things done.
Well, so communication, it sounds like, stands out to me as one of the, top skills that he had acquired in his ability to lead people. Was there anything else sort of in his repertoire that stood out to you as far as being a leader, commanding an audience, being able to move people?
He was very organized, and everything he led was very, very well organized. When he came in and he established the first treasury for the American government, later when Jefferson took over, Jefferson was constantly attacking Hamilton and accusing him of corruption and dishonesty and lack of ethics. And finally, when Jefferson was the president, he sent in his new Treasury Secretary and said, I want you to check that all out. I want you to pull out all the closets, find all the mistakes and the dishonesty, and find out everything, the dirt on Alexander Hamilton. And so his person went to do that, came back to Jefferson and said, I can't find anything. He said he created a perfect system. He said, I wouldn't change a thing that he did. And Of course, Jefferson wasn't happy about that. He wanted dirt. But when people were on the inside, looked at what he had created, and of course, then it's a small country with small population. But the way that Hamilton had a way of everything he did. In fact, he developed the Coast Guard to handle tariffs and so on, customs duties and imports. And he would write out all the rules of engagement. If you had to come board a ship, what did you do? Well, they still use that during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1960s. They're still using stuff that Hamilton just sketched out and instruct. Whatever, he'd get down to like what kind of uniform to use and I mean, unbelievable the thoroughness of the kind of paperwork he would produce. Great administrator, left no stone unturned. You gave him a job to do. You knew it was going to be done thoroughly.
Yeah.
But he, he did have his dark side.
Yeah, and you alluded to that a little bit earlier, and we sort of get the sense that he's a bit of a loose cannon. Maybe just as we wrap up here, what are some lessons that we can take from Hamilton's life that we should perhaps be aware of as we try to take our leadership to the next level?
Well, I think for Hamilton, one of his biggest challenges was his past. He just never seemed to be able to really come to grips with it. He was embarrassed by it, and nothing would get him fired up more than attacks upon his honor, his integrity, his legitimacy. The fact that he was such a powerful person, but he wasn't born in America. And boy, I tell you what, in those days, the political attacks were ruthless. And so he that will ultimately be his undoing. But he maybe just two or three things with him. One is that he just didn't know how to ease off the pedal, to ease off the attack. It was all or nothing, and so he just had a way of alienating himself, and even alienating himself from people that wouldn't have necessarily even been an enemy. But he didn't know when to just keep his mouth shut and let silence take place. And he also, interestingly enough, these brilliant, driven people are so fascinating in history because they'll do foolish things too. And at one point, he ends up having basically an affair with a very strange woman that it seems ended up. Her husband ends up blackmailing Alexander Hamilton. In fact, Chernow says it's the first major sex scandal in American politics. There were others, like Jefferson, who were also having sex scandals, but it didn't hit the press like Hamilton's did. And you just think to yourself, this guy's so brilliant, and he values his honor so much. How would he do something so dishonorable? And he loved his wife, seemed a close marriage that got closer over time. He had 8 children that none of them ever spoke unkindly of their father, had a good home life. But then he has this crazy affair that almost costs him everything. And you just look and say, there's almost as if there was a Jekyll and Hyde to Hamilton. And the dark side, he comes from a mother that was accused of being adulterous and living in the steamy side of the West Indies. And then you've got this man who hangs out with George Washington and has aspirations of creating a nation. And so in his own personal conduct, when it came to finances and things like that, incorruptible. You just can't, even when people are looking for dirt, they can't find any. And then he'll just have some crazy sexual dalliance with some woman that's just trying to set him up for to be extorted. And you think to yourself, like, how could a brilliant man do something so foolish? But probably the last thing, of course, is how he died. He
rather famously,
several times he threatened having a duel, and of course, duels were kind of. They were still happening, but it was becoming viewed less and less favorably. Yeah. Why would 2 grown men shoot to kill at each other? Because their honor was, slighted. But and so he had basically gotten right up to duels a couple of times, and had always found an honorable way of backing down. The sad thing is that just a couple of years before that. His own son, Philip, had gotten into a duel and been shot and killed from it. And And he basically had followed the advice of his father. His father had told him, just like, shoot to miss. And just the fact that you went into the duel is honorable, but then don't kill your opponent. Just shoot wide. His son followed his advice, and then the other guy shot to kill and killed it. And now Alexander ultimately is going to do the very same thing. He's going to shoot to miss. And Aaron Burr, who's at that time the vice president of the United States, is going to shoot to kill.
Which that's, just that image of like the vice president of a country dueling with someone, that just seems so foreign to us now.
There's so much that you look back at and you realize, in some ways things have come so far, and yet then some of the same vitriol continues on. But he dies at age 49. Leaving behind a grieving family and wife, and I suppose, like so many great people in history, sometimes the way you die helps to sort of keep you always before people that way. And for years and years, Hamilton was trashed out because Thomas Jefferson, of course, was a great enemy of his, didn't like him, tarnished him, lied about him, and then the next several presidents, Madison, Monroe, followed right along the same line. And because Chernow says Hamilton's probably the only one of the founding fathers, certainly the most gifted, influential politician who never became president of the United States. And because of that, he kind of gets thrown under the bus by history for a long time. And perhaps that's why he's made it to the Broadway play now.
Yeah, finally having his...
But you look at a man that was very ambitious to prove himself, and when that's harnessed in the right way, you can obviously accomplish a lot from that. But it's almost like a ticking time bomb, because you can only be driven by the dysfunction of your past so long, trying to quiet the demons of your past for so long before eventually you just can't hold it all together. And whether it was his affair, whether it was a duel, he finally comes to the end, and he's undone really by his past, his insecurities that people just knew how to tweak those insecurities, and he felt obliged to have to put his life on the line for it. And so one of those colorful moments in American history.
Absolutely.
But every time you pull out a $10 bill, you're reminded of his influence now several centuries ago.
Yeah, well, certainly a very colorful character, and sounds like a great read. I might have to pick that up one day.
Before you get to the play, you have to read his 800-plus page biography first.
Somehow I don't see that happening, but a guy can hope. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Once again, it's based on the biography by,
Ron Chernow.
Ron Chernow. It's called Alexander Hamilton, and it is actually the book that the popular play, Broadway play, has been based on. And definitely encourage you to pick up your copy. Fascinating guy. Lots to learn. I'm sure we could do another 2 or 3 podcasts on him. But I think we'll leave it there for now.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.